In the world's greatest country, in its most pivotal state, lies Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley, an economic hub that's as vibrant as it is ideologically eclectic. Its just over 700,000 residents will play a critical role in deciding the course of American leadership and thereby the world. Who are the thinkers, workers, and leaders that will decide our collective fate? Join me, Moshe Kurtz, as I walk through the valley and find out. All right, my friends, thank you for joining me today as I walk through the valley with Mr. Harry Fisher, a resident of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and previously a senior visual journalist for The Morning Call, which is the second longest continuously published newspaper in the Lehigh Valley since 1883. Now, a little bit about our friend, Mr. Fisher. He received his bachelor's in journalism from California State University and an associate's in journalism and photojournalism from Los Angeles Valley College. He began his career at the Los Angeles Times and was later recruited in 1984 to join the visual staff of The Morning Call, where he was recognized as Visual Journalist of the Year in 2012. And Mr. Fisher has received awards from the National Press Photographers Association, Pennsylvania Press Photographers Association, the Associated Press Managing Editors Association, and National Photographers Pictures of the Year competition. Needless to say, Mr. Fisher has a long and illustrious career in the American press and in the local press as well. So with that being said and established, I guess I'd like to ask you, what is the current state of American media and the press as we know it today?
So that's a brilliant question. There's been a sort of cataclysmic amount of change that has occurred in at least newspaper publishing, which is what I'm most familiar with. When I began my career, we were still shooting film, as most people could probably realize. And actually, the funny part about that is when I started at The Morning Call in 1984, we were using film cameras that were able to autofocus, as an example, and shoot a tremendous amount of individual images on one roll of film rapidly, as much as maybe, let's say, 5 to 8 frames per second, which was a pretty dramatic thing back in 1984. And that evolved to, as everybody knows, into the digital world, where we no longer were making, when I started at The Morning Call, we were making wet prints. We were developing film with chemicals and getting ourselves wet and dirty and having to spend time in a dark room, use a typewriter to manually type a caption. And if I was writing a story, I would have to type that up on a piece of paper.
This is like prehistoric times for me.
Prehistoric times. And that evolved to the point where, not only did we have to basically record the images electronically, but we had to transmit these images. I remember the first test, I went on one of the first tests, I think around 1996, where I was tasked at a very important basketball competition in Maryland to send pictures back to the desk live so we could get these pictures in the morning newspaper. And I remember it took me around 45 minutes to send 2 pictures. Fast forward to now, it wouldn't be impossible for me to send, say, 50 to 60 pictures in an hour.
Wow.
To a desk, which could then get those online or put them in print. Oh. So that was the image from the photo and image side. From the regular news gathering side, print journalism, when I started my career, was the main source of information for people. People might have watched the network news at night to get additional information or to get some additional national information. But in a place like the Lehigh Valley, The Morning Call and other newspapers was the main go-to source for news. And we took that role very seriously, and we had journalists cover every facet of society here. Reporters had a thing called a beat, which was a given area of coverage which they would specialize in. We had medical reporters. We had people that were focused on courts. We had people that were focused just on police goings-on. We had people focused on investigative journalism. We had people focused on food and fashion.
Wow.
So every facet of society, there was a good chance we had a single human being or maybe as many as 3 or 4. And we had a blanket coverage of everything in Lehigh Valley so that we could distill all of that and put out a newspaper on a daily basis to help people understand what was relevant on that given day. And I'm very proud to be part of that history because as things evolved, of course, there were economic pressures and newsrooms began to downsize. Mm-hmm. And the Morning Call became part of that story. I mean, we were, at one time, the photo department that I worked in, the visual department that I worked in, was actually larger than many newsrooms in Lehigh Valley today. Wow. So there's been lots of change. And to be fair, I think those journalists that are still working are doing the best they can. And the editors that are in charge of the journalists are doing the best they can to really try to focus on what's important.
Well, I consider myself among the faithful followers. I subscribe to the Morning Call, and I appreciate the kind of journalism that they provide on the local level. Speaking of the local level, I'm not part of the press. I'm not part of the media. I'm just a consumer. And I'm familiar with the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. I'm familiar with Fox, CNN, MSNBC. These are what we would call, I think, more national kinds of press publications. And you spent a critical part, I mean, virtually most, if not all, of your career in what we call local news. And I guess a question that I'm a millennial, and many of us are turning to social media outlets, or maybe we're focusing on the national level, all the big foreign policy issues. We're recording this right after the whole operation in Venezuela. There's discussions about America's involvement in Greenland. Why should we be focusing on the small things here in the Lehigh Valley? Why is that important?
Well, if you live here in Lehigh Valley and you're a taxpayer here in Lehigh Valley, then the things that are going on in Lehigh Valley are not small things. Well said. I suppose for somebody that just comes out here from, moves here from another state, and I did hear from folks that had, when I first started my career here, they had just moved here from other regions and they had trouble kind of grasping why something going on in Allentown, as an example, was relevant. But if you live here enough time and you're a taxpayer and you put your children in the public schools, let's say, then you're going to be very much wanting to connect with how things in our local region affect you. So local journalism is the core of why newspapers began. If you go back to the beginning of newspaper publishing in America, it wasn't national newspapers per se. It was, some town crier in wherever you lived. And that's what people needed and wanted. There was no other form. There was no broadcast journalism. There was no, obviously no internet. What is being lost right now potentially in this sort of social media world that we're living in is the notion that it's important that there be a reporter revealing to the public on a regular basis what our public officials are doing. And that's really, in a way, the basis of our constitutional democracy. The idea that there's a free press that will look over the shoulders of our elected officials and report to us what things they are doing or not doing that are relevant to us. And unfortunately, if you start a online news site out of your garage, you're not likely to have the personnel to attack these kinds of possibly critical issues. And possibly one step further would be in the area of what we call investigative journalism, where a reporter might be dedicated to one story for a number of months. And I worked on one piece where a reporter was dedicated for over a year and focus on one particular issue, one set of issues that were relevant, and getting into the trenches and spending dozens and dozens of man or woman hours to uncover a story or a problem or something that was really of interest to people that maybe they wouldn't know unless somebody did this sort of work. So that is what is under threat right now.
Well, we'll return to that in just a moment, but I was always told in literature class that there's a principle called show, don't tell. I'm sure it exists in journalism as well, which is, I think you just pointed to something very important about investigative journalism and about the level of detail that the local news media and press is able to dig into that maybe those looking zoomed out in the national level are simply not noticing. From your own career, are there any instances of important, breaking news or investigations or things that you've covered that really bring out that point in the local news?
Well, I had 2 career highlights, I would say, but there's a lot of investigative work I was attached to, lots of documentary photojournalism I was involved with over decades. But probably two of my career highlights, if I could cite those here, would be myself and a reporter were engineered a project documenting the Moravian Church's mission to Tanzania.
Just for a moment, the Moravian Church, for those not
so the Moravians are a group of German-speaking settlers that came here originally from Moravia, which is currently part of the Czech Republic. And they were German-speaking, and they came here during the Protestant Reformation, and they founded the city of Bethlehem.
That makes a lot of sense. You see, I'm originally a New Yorker, so I'm not saying there aren't any Moravians there, but there's certainly the name is not as prominent as when I came into the Lehigh Valley. So that already was educational for me. So what did you cover when you were looking into
this? What happened was, the background of the story is probably just as interesting as the story itself. I was wandering around the streets of Bethlehem fairly mid-career. It was around 2005. I had good relationships with some of the leaders of the Moravian Church who would always help me get the visuals I needed on specific stories involving either a Christian holiday or something related to the Moravians, either one. And my joke about it was, when I started the Morning Call in 1984, you couldn't walk down the streets of Bethlehem without hearing the word Moravian somewhere within a few minutes' time. That evolved, and eventually the Moravian Church and the Moravians as a group, I think, became less prominent in terms of at least the public perception of who they were. So I had this idea in my head that we should do some kind of project telling the story of the Moravians. That was my just vague general idea I had in my head. And what sort of made it sort of mystical was within a few weeks of that moment, I actually had an assignment with the Moravians, and I met up with one of their senior pastors who told me, did you hear about what we're doing over in Tanzania? And I said, no. What are you doing in Tanzania? So he tells me about this mission involving about 6 Moravians to go to a number of villages in very rural, poor part of Tanzania. And Tanzania, by the way, is one of the poorest countries on earth.
Oh, wow.
So it sounded pretty interesting. So I ran back into the office telling one of our senior editors, and he said, oh, this potentially could be good. Let's see if we can, write up a project proposal. So we recruited, a reporter a very talented woman by the name of Veronica Torrejon. And Veronica and I worked with this editor, Will Shine, on producing a template for what this project potentially would be. Long story short, the template was tweaked. Veronica and Will specifically put together more of a newsy angle to it. We got approval for the project, and Veronica, we had 3 weeks to get all the vaccinations and all the paperwork cleared to spend what would become 3 weeks on the ground in a variety of very rural villages in Tanzania. The Moravians were not only there to basically sort of set up shop as a church entity, but also the primary reason actually we were there was to talk about what they were doing in terms of their social work. And they were building schools, building clinics, funding all kinds of things to help society, including at that moment, the AIDS epidemic. There were a massive amount of orphans as a result of AIDS, and they were addressing that financially and with human resources. So we were there to document that.
And I believe I've actually met some people in the Lehigh Valley who moved from Tanzania to the area over here. Do you know if that's a result of that work? Or?
Because they may not even be Moravians. It's hard to know.
Right.
Because in the area of Tanzania there were Muslims and Christians and tribal religion folks. In fact, we went into tribal villages, where nobody had ever seen a Caucasian before.
Oh, wow.
So that was a very powerful thing for myself to experience as a journalist. And the other project I'll just quickly state was I was sent to Israel for the 50th anniversary of the state, and we documented a number of folks who made Aliyah or decided to move to Israel for either religious reasons or other ideological reasons. And that was a very rewarding project as well. So those two things really, I think, are a testament of what a local news operation, when they have the funding, can get, really into the trenches of a very important topic and expend a lot of resources and time to tell the story.
Absolutely. So I appreciate getting to know a little bit more about your career. And I think this is interesting that you came in with a local angle. You're looking at the Moravians who have a real establishment over here, but then it kind of took you to something a little bit more global. And that's a truth with, I think, with a lot of politics also, is that there's this saying that, all politics is local. And sometimes it does actually begin on the local level. Now, what I guess if it's all right if we pivot a little bit here.
Well, let me just want to add.
Oh yeah, sure, go for it.
As a middle-sized newspaper, we are and we're always looking at the local angle to some bigger contextual stories.
Right.
So those two examples were, yes, they were stories that involved possibly going out of state or out of the country, but our angle on it really was telling it from the Lehigh Valley reader's perspective. And so that's our mission.
And that's important because, I'm going to break the fourth wall for a moment over here. One of the main motivations, if not the main motivation of this interview series that we're doing, is that the Lehigh Valley is considered to be a bellwether and a microcosm of broader American life. The eclectic nature of ethnicities, ideologies, the people who make up the 700,000 residents of Lehigh Valley, when we're talking about things happening here on the local level, chances are they could be generalized to the national level for the United States. So it's actually really important, especially where we are living, to take a look in detail what's happening on the local level, because chances are it's going to reverberate much more widely. But that's me editorializing. Speaking of which, so I want to pivot a little bit. This is something that applies, I'm sure, to a certain degree in the local media, but definitely the national media and press organizations are the ones who are getting more of this kind of scrutiny, which is you'll hear people talk about a media bias. I don't think it would be a huge, idea for me to say that Fox News, many people say, is like the conservative. CNN is trying to change a little bit, but MSNBC is kind of regarded as the liberal media. Some people are trying to make an unbiased media. Do you believe that there's a problem of biased media out there today? Do you think certain stations could be regarded as biased? Is it possible to even be politically neutral? This, I know, is a national issue, but I'm sure on the local level, there's what to discuss as well.
Well, you're sort of asking a million questions in one.
You can choose what direction you want to go in with that. I'm giving you some license.
That's fine. So let me just back up and just talk a little bit about the whole notion of bias versus non-bias. So on one hand, one could say that a human being who does any activity in this world can never be completely unbiased. You always have to have a perspective of some type. And that largely, or in many cases, at least partially, potentially largely, would be shaped by your own personal life experiences, let's say. Mm-hmm. We were trained in print journalism to be unbiased as much as we could be. We were not allowed to take positions publicly. To this day, I have never revealed my political orientation publicly in Lehigh Valley. I find it interesting that there's been this very strong response over the last 4 to 8 years in terms of, I'll call it a dimmer view of journalism in general in our national political landscape. However, what I find ironic is what has been the result of that. What has been the outcome? And the outcome is that the average American right now is reliant on social media to get its news. And what has that been? So social media is largely unsubstantiated.
Right.
Has been highly exaggerated, it's been all the things that we were taught not to do when I was trained in journalism.
At the time of this recording, there was the altercation, let's call it, in Minneapolis with ICE and Renee Good. And I'm seeing countless videos on Facebook and other social media platforms of ICE and altercations with people. And I'm able to tell, when you look closely, you could tell it's AI generated. And the issue is that, usually the social media organizations and, Google's Gemini, they'll watermark things. But I mean, someone with basic technological facility could get around that. And so I'm just being inundated with all of these kinds of videos showing altercations some are true and some are just easily generated on, I think, Sora and other kinds of AI programs these days.
So I personally believe social media is dangerous in terms of relying on social media to be its primary news content provider. And it's very worrisome to me that human beings in at least this current society have lost sight of the value of having local journalists in the streets, reporting on these local things we discussed earlier. I was always taken aback when persons would say to me, oh, the Morning Call was biased at this or definitely biased at that. We had a managing editor who worked there for many, many decades. He would say this fairly often, that the goal was to not upset too many groups at the same time.
In my line of work as clergy, that rings very true.
Yes. So I think if a newspaper in its old print version form, and even today's world, the online journalist who's working in a robust newsroom where everybody has their area of specialization and everybody is out there, in whatever capacity to report local news, you're gonna make mistakes once in a while. We're human beings. We try to get it right. As a visual journalist, I always wanted to be accurate when I depicted my images or my videos.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you miss the mark somewhere. And occasionally it would be, a really highly negative reaction that was really disproportionate to what actually really occurred.
That makes sense.
I made a mistake. We strived very, very hard to get it right. And stories and visuals were reviewed by layers of editors in many cases to make sure it was on mark.
Well, let me get your thoughts on this. And I know I don't try to go too deeply into the political, but politics overlaps with, current events, and really it's all about, thinking about important issues that affect us. So during the, I guess no longer recent presidential elections that we had, there was an interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris, and I believe it was on 60 Minutes. Now, what they have to do is, because they have to keep it, as the name suggests, to 60 minutes, I believe, so they edit the interview, and they don't put everything in there. And there was a moment in her interview in which she began to ramble. And this was always one of the critiques that her opponents had of her, that she would kind of ramble on. She would start making up words. It would be what they would call word salad. And what they did on that program when they presented it to the public was that they cut out the word salad, and they made her sound more articulate than she was in reality. And so the Republican side accused them of media bias. They responded saying, what do you mean? This is editorial discretion. We're just trying to give our audience the essentials. And I'm sitting here listening thinking, I kind of see both sides on this, because that's a critical flaw I would want to know about. On the other hand, I understand that they're trying to cut out the extra pieces, but the extra pieces might actually be informative and essential. So I'm curious, just how do you approach cases like that?
So I think what you're asking is a question of fine line, because you're right. You can't err. Let's say I interviewed you for a newspaper story for 2 hours.
Right.
I know that at the end of the day, the video is going to be 1 minute to 2 minutes, let's say.
I still remember that. We did our first menorah lighting at Allentown City Hall, WFMZ, which is another local news station. They came in, there was a cameraman there. He videos the entire thing. And I was like, he said, it's going to appear on WFMZ tonight. I'm like, I'm at the TV. I'm waiting for it to appear on. My wife is there. The kids are there. And all of a sudden it's like 10 to 15 seconds, there was a menorah lighting at City Hall. And there's a quick flash of me with the mayor and with the city council. And then just as soon as it came on, it came off. And I was like, wait, what? What happened to the rest of it? So you're right. There's
So I want to sort of go back to what your question was. So your question was related to a specific 60 Minutes interview.
Yeah.
And now, to be fair, I was not in the editing room while all that content was streaming over the monitor to decide what had to be edited. But I will tell you that in general, it was an agreed custom amongst all national media, local media, wherever, that you would edit to preserve the most relevant elements of an interview or the most relevant elements of a story in general. As a reporter, I might go out and collect all kinds of facts about a given topic. but the story has to be what we used to say 10 or 20 inches long, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't fit everything in.
Right.
So it becomes a little bit arbitrary as to where those cuts, if you will, begin or end.
Yeah.
I'm not going to comment on politicizing of this. I think there is politicizing that goes on because, as an example, if I come out to an event that I'm not going to talk about the 60 Minutes case, but if I went to a public event in Lehigh Valley of a politician speaking, and let's say I went to one of their opponents, especially like in a campaign, we were really careful to make sure we tried to keep the playing field even in terms of coverage of both parties in a local election, let's say. We were careful to try to be fair in our editing, but that didn't mean that political official felt that he wasn't or she wasn't in the video or in the storyline as much as they should have been.
You know what this reminds me of? We have young kids, and sometimes you give one scoop of ice cream to one kid and one scoop to the other, and all of a sudden they come out with a tape measure and say, well, actually, she got a bigger scoop of ice cream. And you say, I can't win, just accept what you got.
I mean, to be fair, most political officials are pretty astute about what journalists do. Mm-hmm. So I can't say that this is a categorical problem, but occasionally you would run into a situation where somebody, it didn't have to be a political official, it could be a CEO somewhere, who would perceive a given level of coverage wasn't truly representing what they manufactured in their mind should be portrayed.
Right.
The job of the journalist, the job of the news media person is to be an observer. We are not telling the story from the inside. We're telling it, we're observers.
Right. You are a third party here.
Correct. So if you're the first party, you might think that we didn't get it completely right.
Mm-hmm. Right. They're not propagandists.
They're not propagandists. What does the average person on the streets in America or in Pennsylvania or in Lehigh Valley need to know? Right. And we want to be true to that point.
Right. So I want to circle back. There's a perception out there, obviously not shared by everybody, but why is it that so many people think, or at least allege, that the establishment media, as they call it, is biased toward the left politically? Do you have a sense of why that's
so we can talk about that. So there's reality and there's perception.
Right. I'd love to get into that.
So I'll talk about the perception part first. So I think why this perception began goes back to sort of how print journalism became truly relevant in American society. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to as far back as print journalism was available, as an example, here in Lehigh Valley. We were always involved with documentary projects. We were always involved with trying to get in deep into society and finding problems that the average person wasn't aware of. And that had to do with poverty. Many cases had to do with poverty. During the Depression, of course, there were some very significant underlying events that were occurring in society. We were doing all the reporting, but we realized that in some cases, we could potentially be the only voice for some underserved citizens. Mm-hmm. So as a result, there were some projects that won Pulitzer Prizes, as an example, became prominent nationally, along with really important investigative projects like Watergate, that brought us to the forefront as far as our relevance in society. Mm-hmm. So as that occurred, along with how I think we sort of, through our education, through our exposure to the general world, and our human compassion for those that were either underserved or less privileged, I'll say the word. Mm. We started to develop projects around those, and that, I think, made us feel that there's some big guys out there with big, deep pockets, potentially, and some very powerful political folks, let's say, over the decades. They really kind of became disconnected from the lower tiers of society.
Right.
So many journalists sort of developed an idea. They could try to fill part of that gap. So as a result of that, going forward into the 2000s, I think that some people in society perceived that the journalism had swung too far to that degree. Mm. I don't necessarily believe that was true in most cases.
Right.
But I can't argue over the fact that in today's world, there are some television stations that are perceived to be either to the left or to the right. I can't explain to you why that occurred in those cases, but I can say that depending on their focus. And if you're focused on politics, that becomes highly charged whether you're left or you're right.
Right.
So I think the journalism that I was trained in was one of balance. And we always strive to tell both sides of the story.
Absolutely. Something I just want to circle back to, which is you made this argument, which I'm very sympathetic to, which is that we should not be relying on social media as our news source, certainly not as our primary news source. However, there are some who have pushed back on that a little bit, or maybe a lot, and have promoted social media as almost like a populist countermeasure to the establishment media. Many media outlets, I think virtually all, have some sort of corporate control. I believe Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post outright, and there was a controversy over that and him maybe exerting his control on that. And Elon Musk, who has bought Twitter and now known as X, I'm still getting used to saying that, his whole pitch is that this is how we hold the establishment, which is in his eyes held by the few powerful elites, even though of course he's part of the powerful elites as well, he's just on the other side, and having something like X or social media platforms democratizes the process. It lowers the bar, which I understand why that'd be pushed against, because you don't have the fact checking as much. But on the other hand, think about, this is a classic one. People on the right would say the Hunter Biden laptop case, in which it was suppressed by the news media, or during COVID, when any sort of theory that maybe it originated in Wuhan in China was discredited. And then later on, experts began opening up to it. He's arguing that social media is maybe a check on the establishment media.
So I think the bigger question you're asking me is regards to, is it a good thing or a bad thing that various forms of media are either under the control of one individual or a wealthy corporation, let's say, versus the older model that I grew up in and served my career in, which was a family-owned newspaper.
Really? Wow, I feel like I never hear of those.
Well, the Morning Call was family-owned when I got hired technically, but became corporate in 1985. Okay, but it was a small corporation compared to the big, massive.
Yeah, what's the fundamental difference? Who owns it? Does that change how it operates?
Well, in theory, it shouldn't. Because newsrooms were supposed to be independent of their ownership and publishers. The only example where that wouldn't be true would be in what they called the editorial board. So you had an editorial board of 1 to 3, depending on the size of the newspaper, could be much larger. The Morning Call, we had probably an editorial board of maybe maximum probably 5 people. And those people would meet together and talk about, okay, from sort of more from a business standpoint. So that would be an opportunity for the publisher to have their voice heard.
Well, not to interject, but to interject, that has always troubled me, that editorial boards of newspapers and media corporations will endorse a candidate, because you're basically saying we have a preference. We have a bias.
Okay, so
outright. So right there, just like no denial of it anymore.
All right, for the largest part of my career, the corporation itself did not dictate what could be covered or what shouldn't be covered. When you evolve to the point that we're in now, where I'm not going to pick a name, but a specific wealthy person decides just for their own personal reason that they don't want this covered, or they don't want to upset that individual over there in the political echelons. That is dangerous. And that actually is what's occurring. And furthermore, if we start talking about bias versus unbiased, in social media, there's no filters. There's no layers of editors, or there's no journalistic oversight to help put another set of eyes on a given topic or a certain amount of content and say, wait a minute, this needs to be more fact-checked.
Right. There's a difference between a paper versus a peer-reviewed academic paper.
So, this idea that the media swung one way or the other, I think people are expending way too much resources on that idea. I think what people should be concerned about is what is happening with social media and how artificial intelligence has gotten involved, how a lot of very distorted, totally biased information is being circulated. Just yesterday, I looked at some artificial created content showing things that didn't happen. It was made up. And many people who read those posts on the items I was looking at thought they were true and thought they were accurate.
Wow.
So that is, it seems to me from a societal standpoint, if we're going to worry about how media has evolved, that's where we should put our focus, not on what has happened in traditional media.
Right. That's the, I would hope that conservatives, progressives, Republicans, Democrats, I mean, this is almost a human versus technology issue now. It's not even a human on human. It's a human versus technology. And I would hope everybody should be able to get behind some kind of safety protocols around these things. But anyway, just one last thing, and then we'll head into our conclusion, just about the editorial boards, because that always troubled me. And that's where the Bezos issue came up with the Washington Post. How is it conscionable for a news corporation, like we were talking about this whole time, it's supposed to remain unbiased and impartial, to be endorsing a candidate? Even from a perception standpoint, when one news corporation, or one outlet, I should say, not the corporation, when they endorse Kamala Harris, they're basically telling me that they are a liberal publication. And if they endorse Trump, I see them as a Republican publication. And even if you're going to say that, no, they took a really impartial, unbiased look at both candidates and analyze, and I would hope that's what they do, there's also the trust building aspect, right? We want to build trust amongst people, and that way they're not turning to social media to get their news. So I just don't understand that whole...
So you're asking a really good question. And the best way I can answer is to say as follows. And I tried to touch upon this earlier. In general, the bosses, the owners of a publication stayed out of the newsroom.
Right.
They did not get involved in day-to-day coverage issues at the newsroom. And that would rarely occur at the morning call. I can tell you right now.
That's good to know.
The editorial board was their one little sliver of opportunity to get their voice heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that was recognized as a reasonable way for a publisher to have their voice. In other words, the publisher is sort of, they're the ones funding this operation.
Yeah.
They're not involved with 90% of the content that's going into the into print.
So we'll throw them a bone every now and then.
So it wasn't throwing them a bone. It was saying, okay, this is an appropriate place for you to be heard. And if we did our jobs correctly, we trained our audiences to understand that, okay, this is what the publisher officially says is what the publisher is recommending you do with your vote.
Yeah.
As a reader, I could view that information along with any other information regarding what my options were as a voter, and take that into consideration or not. That was an individual choice. If you were to take that specific model of the publisher inserting their views throughout the whole news medium or the whole publication itself, I could see where you could say, well, geez, that's really biased. But we're talking about one little tiny sliver of the operation, and I think that if you compare that to the current models that we're in, where big corporate owners are getting really knee deep, and there was a case recently that was cited from the new editor who was placed by the new publisher at CBS regarding some last minute editorial decisions that were made heavy-handed that really upset a lot of journalists because
you're not allowed to say it, but I'll say Barry Weiss, I presume we're referring to.
Yeah, documentary. I'm not gonna Monday morning quarterback.
No, I'm not gonna push you into
yeah. But I'm just gonna say this: if indeed the journalists' uproar at CBS was toward the notion that a decision was made based upon the corporation's concern about upsetting somebody in the political echelon, that would be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that would never have occurred at the morning call. There were mayors. Our publisher, our editors used to field phone calls all the time from people who were upset, and that would not influence coverage unless it involved an inaccuracy or something that was fraudulent, something like that. If there was a fact that was called out that was wrong and we could go back and verify that the fact was wrong, guess what? we would have to publish a correction and say we made a mistake.
And you know what? I relate to this because in my line of work as clergy, so every, Saturday morning, that's when we hold our major synagogue service, though we have daily services also, as you well know. People come in, I deliver a sermon. Now, most weeks I try not to rock the boat. I just try to explain the Torah and I try to give a nice lesson we can all agree with. But if, 20 sermons go by and nobody has a complaint about something I said, that's bad news because it means I probably didn't tell them anything of import. It probably means I didn't try teaching them something new and trying to get them to think critically about a certain issue. So I think that's actually true for the media as well, if you would agree, that if you're just publishing nice stories about new ice cream shops opening, I mean, that's a nice thing to know about. But the investigative journalism, really getting into the heart of the community and what's operating within it, if you're not fielding those angry phone calls here and there, then maybe that's not a good indication. You don't want too many of them, but the right balance, perhaps.
So relevant to what you just said, there was a case at the Morning Call in the mid-2000s, 2010, 2012, I don't remember the exact year, where the Morning Call got involved in an investigative project involving some allegations that weren't too favorable for a specific corporation, which I'm not going to name.
Mm-hmm.
So the tricky thing at that point was print advertising became much more critical to the viability of a newspaper than it was, let's say. So if one advertiser back in 1985 said, I'm not happy with you reporting on my store, I'm yanking all my ads, that wouldn't have a huge influence into the way the paper operated financially, right? But by the time 2000, let's say 10 rolls around or so, if a major advertiser threatened you and said, look, either you fix this or we're gone, from a publisher standpoint, that would be something you'd at least have to weigh in on. And I'm not going to say in this specific case it had a direct effect on the way we covered news. I don't think it did. But I'm saying that there was definitely more pressure in newsrooms, in print journalism newsrooms, as advertising became weakened and the newspaper became more reliant on online projects to help sort of make up for any funding that dissipated from the lack of print advertising.
Right. Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I personally have learned a lot about and it's good to know I'm a consumer, so learning a little bit more about what's under the hood and the inner workings of the press, and certainly the local press, has been educational for me. Looking back on your career, right now I don't know if you technically identify as retired. I know you're still doing some important projects. But, kind of looking back at your illustrious career with the Morning Call and in other capacities, what would be, I like to call it like your Lehigh legacy? What would be your crowning achievements that you have?
I think I'm proud of what I did here. I'm very proud of the fact that I served during really what was the peak of print journalism in American history. I had the good fortune of experiencing local news reporting and serving as a local content provider from sort of the ground up, starting in a small little bureau with literally a husband and wife team who were organizing a group of 12 people out in Bethlehem, all the way up to a point where we, at the peak of the Morning Call's economic, status, we're able to cover things that took us into international domains, and everything in between that. Being in the trenches with virtually every type of corporation, every type of profession, every relevant event that happened, being that sort of fly on the wall to observe and to report and to be a storyteller and to document. All those things were, I just can't place a financial value on that in terms of what it means to me personally. And I'm very grateful to having had that opportunity for as long as I did. And the only sad sort of part to this is I don't think what I did really is really necessarily something that can be easily done now, because obviously print journalism is a much smaller entity than it was. But I'm very proud of having served the Lehigh Valley, getting to know persons in every strata of society, financial institutions, political institutions, social service institutions, virtually every facet of society, I had a chance myself to be a part of the storytelling. And I think the Morning Call, to its credit, was really on top of all of the above and gave journalists like myself an opportunity which we would not have had if they weren't as successful as they were. And I'd like to think that people still who recognize my name, who are still looking at journalism online or wherever they get their information, will reflect back on any personal dealings they had with me as a journalist and say, yeah, that guy, he was really fair. He worked really hard to do his job.
I appreciate that. And I hope more people have your integrity, and I hope more people, consumers, speaking for myself, turn to people like you to get their news.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Fisher, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you joining me as I walk through the valley.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining me as I walk through the valley. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to our show. If you have questions or would like to book a live recording or have a speaking request, please email rabbi@sonsofisrael.net. This is Moshe Kurtz. I look forward to having you join me next time as I walk through the valley.